Hello, and welcome back to The Secrets of Storytelling with me, Katrice Horsley. As I said in the first episode, I'm a storyteller and narrative consultant, a former National Storytelling Laureate of the United Kingdom, and also have been working and using stories as my main tool in development work and organizational change work for the last 30 years, so quite a long time. Um, and a lot of my passion and a lot of my knowledge of the potency and power of storytelling came from when I lived in Ghana. I lived in Ghana for 6 years, and I saw stories being used in so many different ways. And I thought, yeah, that's what I want to do. I want to connect my passion for people and words, and my passion for communities and change. I want to stick those all together. And storytelling was the glue that made it all happen. So I wanted to talk today about the first section of our series of 12 episodes on the secrets of storytelling. So the section's still coming under the brain, but in episode 2, we are going to be talking about empathy and how stories help promote empathy. And that's on a neurobiological level. I think before I kick off, I wanted to share with you that I have seen this and witnessed this, and anybody who uses stories will know this as well. That stories give us the ability to change our views of people who we might see as other. And I did a lovely intergenerational project, and it was actually funded by the West Midlands Police Force as part of their crime prevention strategy. And it was with local young people and elderly people who were used to visit at a daycare centre. And there had been a recent spate of muggings against elderly people. And so the police wanted to do some intervention work early on. And I remember I collected stories from these elderly people and I shared them with the young people. And they didn't see each other at first. I didn't let them meet each other. I just wanted the stories to go before the people. And there was one guy, Bill, who'd shared a story about how he'd learnt to fly a Spitfire. And there was another about a lady who called herself Nelly No Knickers because she'd only had one pair of knickers and she'd gone on holiday. And she'd washed them every night and hung them outside to dry. And then somebody had nicked her knickers. And so her friends called her Nelly No Knickers. So she told the story of how she got that name. And then the young people listened to these stories and they were blown away by them. And they wrote letters and postcards to the elderly people saying, you know, you must have been really brave, Bill, or Nellie, you sound hilarious. And it was only after they'd shared stories with each other, you know, the young people then wrote and shared their stories with the elderly people, and the elderly people read those and wrote responses back. It was only when they'd heard each other's stories that I then let them meet each other. And what happened was the young people kind of rushed in, and there was this group of quite frail elderly people. Some of them couldn't use normal cups to drink, they had those sippy cups, and some of them were dribbling a little bit and all covered up and blankets around them, etc. And the young people came in and they were like, where's Bill, where's Bill? And he was that man in the corner, and they didn't see the elderly man in the corner. They saw the young hero who'd flown the Spitfire. And when I pointed out Nellie, they didn't see that elderly lady. They saw a hilarious woman who went on holiday with her friends and lost her knickers. And the stories enabled these young people to view the elderly people and experience them in a totally different way. And it was the same with the elderly people. They viewed these young people in a totally different way. And so a new relationship started between them. So I always knew that stories had that ability, but I didn't know why. And now I do, and all of you will too. So let me talk about empathy. I'm going to refer to some work that was done by a guy called Paul J. Zak at Claremont. And I'm going to mention a woman called Perry Firth, who's done a series of amazing articles, 3 articles, all about storytelling and empathy specifically. And I'll put those links in the bottom of the video. So Paul J. Zak was the guy who found out about cortisol being released, oxytocin being released, and dopamine being released, all of those things that I talked about in the last episode. And he researched that because he'd been on a plane watching $1 Million Baby, the movie with Hilary Swank and Clint Eastwood, where she's a boxer. And I won't tell you the end. Spoiler, but he got very emotionally involved in that movie and ended up crying on the plane. And he wanted to know why that was. And so he set up this research and he found out about this hormones being released when we are engaged in stories. He also found out that people were more likely to give money to charities after watching emotionally engaging movies. They were more likely to have a reduction in racial bias. There was even some research which was based around a story to do with a Muslim woman. And then people were shown photographs of Arabic looking faces and white faces, all kind of split, different faces all lined up. And there was a control group, the same, and those people who had read the book reacted totally differently to the control groups that hadn't read the book when there were questions about, you know, who looks angry or who do you think might be aggressive or etc., etc. And the people who had read the book just didn't really pick out any particular face as looking particularly angry. And this was done in the States. But the control group picked out mostly the Arab looking, whatever that means, faces as the angry ones or the aggressive ones. So there is this nuanced ability for the changing of particular set beliefs after we have read stories. However, we also know that sometimes we read a story or we hear a story or we watch a story and it doesn't have the same effect. And what has been found, and there's some brilliant work by a guy called Brian Stern, perhaps I'll put his link on as well. What needs to happen for the production of those hormones and that neurobiological impact to occur, what needs to happen is transportation. We need to be transported in the story. And for us to be transported, there has to be very few distractions. We have to be fluent in the language and the symbols being used, and we have to have our attention grabbed through perhaps a dilemma in the story or something that we need to know. And that links into story structures. But let me talk about this idea of no distraction and Brian Stern. So Brian developed this brilliant image for what happens when we listen to a storyteller. And he starts off with the storyteller in a circle, S, storyteller in a circle, the story, storytellers telling the story, and the audience all in their own little circles, all around listening to the story. And as the storyteller progresses telling the story, so the storyteller disappears into the story's around the storyteller. The storyteller is inhabiting the story. And as the storyteller continues telling the story, so the story expands itself and all the listeners are inhabiting the story. They are on the high seas. The waves are thrashing and bashing and crashing against the ship that plunges that they're in it. However, if somebody's suddenly coughing, then the listeners can get pulled out of the story. And if that person stops coughing, then they can re-enter the story. And I've experienced that myself. You know, if I'm telling a story and I'm saying to the audience, and the woman saw coming down the path, and people like look as though the path is behind them. They're in an auditorium, they're in a theatre, but they're so in the story, they believe that it is behind them, above them, below them, by the side of them. So we can be immersed in the story. But if there are too many distractions, if the person next to you is eating crisps, eating crisps, eating crisps, and eating crisps very loudly, you are so focused on the person eating crisps that you can't be enthralled or enchanted by the story. You are not immersed in it any longer. So you're not going to have that oxytocin released, and you're not going to have, actually, you might have a lot of cortisol released because you want to punch the person next to you eating the crisps. So we need to have few distractions. We also need to be fluent in the language that's being used, whether we're reading or whether we're listening. I live in Sweden. I can speak Swedish. I'm not fluent. I can read Swedish. I'm not fluent. I have never read a Swedish book where I have been transported because I'm not fluent enough with the language. And any of the teachers who are here, I want you to think about that. I want you to think of how, yes, we want our children to read, but also about we want our children to develop empathy and to have that release of dopamine when they read stories, that feel good chemical as well as oxytocin. And how can we enable that if they are not yet fluent in the language that they're reading in? So we need a certain amount of fluency in order to be transported. And the other thing we need is this thing to do with attention. We need a dilemma in the story. We need to be engaged in it. We want to know what happens next, so we can't be told everything. And in order for these to happen, we need to use metaphors and sensory language. What do I mean by that? So if I just gave you a list of bullet points, there is a boy, there is a monster, boy meets monster, monster eats boy. The only part of your brain that fires off is your language processing area. It's in your left brain hemisphere, the Broca area or the Wernicke area. If I put that into a story, and if I use sensory language, there was a boy, and he was small and sweet, and his skin was so soft like the fine wing of a moth, and so pale. And one day he was walking along the pavement, and he came to a dark corner where the inky shadows extended out like the tentacles of an octopus. And there was a chill in the air, like something damp and slimy on his skin. And his heart started to beat a little bit faster, but he knew he had to go around the corner. Something pulled at him, and he yearned to go there. And as he rounded the corner, can you see that you want to know what's going to happen when he goes around the corner? So we have that story arc, we have that build up of the story, and our cortisol is very engaged. If you measure the heartbeats of people who are engaged in the story, they speed up. We physically inhabit the story. And if I said to you, oh, I don't know, as I say, just a list of facts, you're knowing the information, but you are not feeling the information. It's a big, big difference between knowing something and feeling something. And Perry Firth, whose article will be linked to this, she talks a lot about this idea of knowing something and feeling something. So in order for empathy to be promoted, we need the release of oxytocin and we need the release of cortisol to focus our attention. And in order for those things to be released, we need to be transported And in order to be transported, we need no distractions or very few distractions. We need to be fluent in the language that is being used. And we need to have a focus for our attention with regards to the structure of the story that we're being given. Now, for me, a lot of the work that I do and have done in Great Britain, particularly, has been working with parents in promoting storytelling rather than story reading. A lot of these parents might be struggling with literacy. The mums, particularly, might not have been available to might not have been allowed, in actual fact, not available, allowed to be educated in their home countries. And when their child brought back a book that was in English, or even their own language that they might not be literate in, they would kind of cast the book to one side because they couldn't read it and they couldn't help their child. And so I did a huge amount of work all around storytelling projects, because almost all of these mums and dads had traditional stories from their homelands. And so we started building up those stories, making books of those stories with textures in and textiles in. And it built up the confidence of the parents in knowing that actually their child's later success, one of the ways we can predict a child's later success, social, cognitive, and emotional, is based on their vocabulary. So they felt that they were helping their child learn and succeed by developing their child's vocabulary, whether in their mother tongue or in the new language that they were learning. So for any teachers out there, it's vitally important. I'll be talking about that later on. But what about you who aren't teachers and are thinking to yourself, well, what does this mean to me as a leader in an organization or within the community, etc.? I would say to you, if you're in organizations, your onboarding program should include stories, personal stories from people who've been working there for some time, that are emotional, that are engaged, that do use sensory language to help those new employees come in and feel witnessed and validated. And it creates empathy both ways, that the new employees can listen to the stories of how present employees felt, and they can engage and feel empathic towards those employees who are new to them. And the ones who the employees who have been employed for some time can listen to the stories of the new employees, the ones who are being onboarded, and again empathy is promoted and engagement and understanding. And with organizations that have used personal narratives within onboarding processes, there is a much higher chance of those new personnel staying. So there are many different ways that we can use story and storytelling within our work situations and our settings. What is incredibly important is that we provide a space for the sharing of stories. That doesn't have to be a physical space, it can be a digital space, it can be an audio space, it can be a reading space. But we need to provide a space for the sharing of stories in order to create a space for the development of empathy, in order to create understanding, togetherness, trust between the people who we are working with or the children who we are working with. It is that simple. Storytelling promotes empathy. Empathy promotes trust and understanding. And trust and understanding, well, that's the glue that should hold a community together. I hope you found that useful. The next episode is going to be all about physicality and storytelling. And by that, I mean the way our bodies change and how storytelling is being used in medical arenas to help us even restore our bodies into healing in some capacity. So I look forward to being with you next week, where we will be looking at episode 3. in The Secrets of Storytelling with me, Katrice Horsley, and it will all be about the brain and physicality and storytelling. Remember to hit the subscribe button, and yeah, I look forward to being with you next week. Bye bye for now.